He thought she was just another accident victim, scared and stuck in a twisted wreck on a rainy highway. But when he pulled her from the car and carried her to safety, he had no idea who she really was, or that weeks later a helicopter would land behind his garage with a message from her, "You're not easy to forget." Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The sky cracked open without warning. One moment it was just another quiet afternoon on the edge of town. The next, rain fell in sheets so heavy it blurred the tree line. Cooper Maddox stood under the corrugated overhang behind his garage, arms crossed, watching the storm swallow the road like a tide coming in too fast. He hated this kind of weather, not because of the cold, not even because it usually meant flooded engines and busted exhausts the next day. No, because when the roads turned slick this fast, someone always ended up in a ditch. The sound reached him before the impact, a shriek of tires, then silence, then the unmistakable sound of metal folding into itself. Cooper dropped the rag from his hand and ran. The rain hit him sideways as he tore across the lot, boots slamming through puddles, heartbeat already climbing. He followed the road out past the last mailbox, toward the curve no one ever slowed down for. That was where it had come from. He knew it. And then he saw it, half buried in a ditch, and tilted like a toy thrown by a careless child, a black SUV still rocking slightly on its crumpled side. He didn't think. He jumped down into the mud, shoes sinking, windshield wipers on the vehicle still ticking uselessly back and forth like a metronome in a broken song. Steam rose from the hood. One headlight blinked into the storm. And behind the fractured driver's side glass he saw her, head slumped, blood trickling down her forehead, both hands still white-knuckled on the wheel. "Hey!" Cooper shouted, slapping the glass. "Can you hear me? Don't move. I'm getting you out." The door was jammed. The frame bent inward. He wedged his shoulder under the seam and pushed with everything he had. Nothing. He backed up, grabbed the crowbar from the truck bed he'd passed, came back swinging. One crack, two. The door moaned, then finally groaned open. Rain poured in. She gasped. "I got you," he said, his voice low, steady. He reached in, braced her neck gently, and pulled her out into his arms. He didn't know her name, but the way she clung to him as he carried her up that slope, he already knew she was going to change something. Maybe everything. She was heavier than she looked, more from the dead weight of unconsciousness than anything else. Cooper's arms ached as he reached the edge of the slope, boots slipping in the rain-slicked grass, breath tearing through his lungs. He wasn't a hero. He was a mechanic with a bad back and sore knees. But he wasn't about to let her die in a ditch. He laid her gently down on the gravel's shoulder, shielding her as best he could from the downpour. Her face was pale. Blood still ran from the gash above her eyebrow, threading into her soaked hair. He leaned in close, checking for breath. It was there, shallow but steady. He exhaled in relief. His hands fumbled for his phone. No signal. Of course. The storm had knocked out service in this stretch before. He glanced up the road toward town, 2 miles. He could run it. But then her eyes fluttered. "Hey," he said, crouching lower. "Stay with me, okay? You're out of the car. You're safe now." Her lips parted. She didn't speak, just looked at him like she wasn't sure if he was real. He gave her the smallest smile, trying to soften the fear in his own voice. "You took a hit, probably a concussion. Don't move too much. Help's coming." She blinked, rain mixing with tears, or maybe just shock. Her body trembled violently beneath her soaked clothes, muscles twitching like she couldn't get warm. Cooper took off his flannel, draped it over her, then stripped off his own jacket and layered that too. Lights appeared in the distance, headlights slicing through the fog like a lifeline. He stood and waved both arms. The sedan skidded slightly as it pulled over, window already down. "There's a woman, trapped, wrecked SUV," Cooper called out. "Call 911. Tell them we need an ambulance now." The driver, wide-eyed, nodded and fumbled for a phone. Cooper dropped to his knees again. She was fading. Her eyes rolled slightly, breath stuttering. "Hey," he whispered. "I'm still here. Stay with me. Just stay." And she did. For a few more long, fragile minutes, she stared at him like he was the only thing tethering her to this world. He didn't even know her name, but already he was terrified of losing her. The ambulance tore through the rain like it was chasing time itself. Red and white lights pulsed across the soaked road as paramedics leapt from the back, their voices sharp, urgent, practiced. Cooper stepped back, chest heaving, clothes clinging to him like second skin, his knuckles scraped raw from the doorframe. "She's got a head wound," he said quickly. "Conscious, but fading. Pulse was steady a few minutes ago." They didn't ask who he was. They didn't need to. He was the guy soaked to the bone, trembling from adrenaline, crouched over the woman like a human shield. One medic took his arm and gently pulled him aside while the others swarmed her with equipment and commands. Cooper backed away slowly, hands open, feeling useless now that the professionals had arrived. But he couldn't take his eyes off her, not as they stabilized her head, not as they lifted her onto the stretcher, not even when the gurney wheels clicked into the back of the ambulance and the doors slammed shut. He stood there as the lights faded into the storm, just breathing, just listening to the rain hit the ground like applause after a play he wasn't sure he survived. A cop pulled up not long after, cruiser lights flashing in lazy rhythm. Cooper gave his statement, answered questions he barely heard himself saying. Name, occupation, time of accident. Did he know the woman? No, but that didn't feel true anymore. By the time the cruiser drove off, the sun was starting to cut through the clouds. The road steamed. Cooper walked back to his garage alone, every step heavier than the last. He peeled off his soaked shirt in the back room, stared at the reflection in the cracked mirror, mud on his jaw, a smear of blood that wasn't his. He washed his hands slowly, but the shaking didn't stop. He sat on the edge of his workbench and stared at the floor for a long time. The shop was quiet again, normal. And yet something had shifted. Something had lodged itself in his chest, right where her face had been burned into his memory. Who was she? Why had fate dropped her into his life like a bolt from the storm? And why couldn't he stop thinking about the way her hand gripped his shirt, like he was the only safe thing left in the world? The next morning the storm was gone, but its shadow hadn't left. Cooper walked into the garage early, the sky still gray with leftover fog. The air smelled like wet concrete and rust. He didn't flip on the radio, didn't start the coffee. He just stood there in the middle of the shop, hands in his pockets, staring at the corner where he'd tossed his soaked clothes the night before. The memory of her, the woman in the wreck, was still clinging to him like the damp in his skin. He didn't even know if she made it. He hadn't gotten a name. No one had called, not the EMTs, not the cops. She had vanished into the back of that ambulance, and the silence since then had been deafening. He tried telling himself that no news was good news, but he didn't believe it. By noon, he couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed his keys and drove out toward the hospital, just to see, just to ask. At the front desk, the nurse barely glanced up from her computer. "I'm sorry, sir, but we can't give out patient information without family clearance." "I'm not asking for medical records," Cooper said, voice tight. "She was in an accident yesterday. Black SUV, head trauma, dark hair. I just want to know if she's okay." The nurse gave him a look that said she'd heard this before. "Are you family?" "No," he swallowed. "I pulled her out of the car." Something shifted in her expression, just a flicker, but she still shook her head. "I'm sorry. That's all I can say." Cooper walked out of there feeling like someone had tied a weight to his ribs. He sat in his truck for a long time, engine idling, fingers drumming the steering wheel. He wasn't sure what he expected. A miracle? A sign? A simple answer? Instead, all he had was the memory of her voice, the little gasp she made when he pulled her from the wreck, the look in her eyes before they closed again, and the storm that had started outside now rolling straight through him, steady and unrelenting. He'd saved her life, but she was still haunting his. By the third day, the silence started to feel personal. Cooper had gone back to work, but nothing felt the same. Every oil change, every tire rotation, every customer that walked through the garage doors felt like a weak attempt at distraction. His hands moved on autopilot, but his mind kept looping back to the same image. Her face, pale, bleeding, afraid, and then gone. He hadn't told anyone, not really, not about how it felt, not about how it hit him in a place deeper than logic. He just kept his head down, kept working. He figured talking about it wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't bring her back, wouldn't give him her name, but that didn't stop him from hoping. Every time the doorbell above the entrance jingled, his chest tightened for a second too long. Every time his phone buzzed, he checked it, like a man expecting something he couldn't explain. But the world just kept on spinning, like none of it had happened. Then, late that afternoon, a car pulled up that didn't belong. A matte gray sedan, polished, with windows tinted darker than legal. It didn't idle like a local car either. It purred, quiet, expensive, deliberate. Cooper wiped his hands and stepped outside just as the passenger door opened. A man in a suit stepped out, neatly pressed, clean-shaven, and entirely out of place next to the rusted sign of Maddox Auto Repair. "You Cooper Maddox?" the man asked. "Yeah," Cooper replied slowly, glancing past him into the car. The windows stayed shut. No movement inside. The man reached into his coat and handed Cooper an envelope. Heavy paper, cream-colored, no stamp, just his name written in a smooth, unfamiliar hand. "She asked me to deliver this personally," the man said. Then he turned, got back in the car, and drove off without another word. Cooper stared down at the envelope, heart suddenly hammering. His name looked almost elegant in that handwriting, like it didn't belong in a grease-stained garage. He opened it with fingers that wouldn't quite steady. Inside was a note, written in dark ink. "You saved my life. I remember everything. I don't know how to thank you, but I'd like to try. Don't worry, this isn't over." No name, no return address, just the faintest trace of perfume on the paper. And the slow, quiet realization that whatever had started on that rainy road hadn't ended in the back of that ambulance. It had only just begun. Cooper didn't sleep that night. The note sat on the table beside his bed like it had weight, real weight. Not just paper and ink, but something denser, something that pressed into his thoughts with every blink, every breath, every heartbeat that refused to slow down. She remembered. That's what echoed the loudest. She remembered the way he pulled her from the wreck, remembered the sound of his voice, the way he shielded her from the rain, the way his jacket clung to her skin when she was slipping away. She remembered, and she sent someone. But she still hadn't told him who she was. By morning, the questions had outpaced the answers by a mile. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror with the note in one hand and a toothbrush forgotten in the other. What kind of woman had the power to send a guy in a tailored suit to deliver a handwritten message? What kind of life was she returning to? And more importantly, why was she keeping him just close enough to hope, but far enough to wonder? By the time he got to the garage, it was already past 9. He hadn't even opened the bay doors when his sister Maya pulled up in her Jeep. She didn't usually stop by unannounced, which meant she either needed a favor or she'd sensed something in him that he hadn't said out loud. "You look like hell," she said, stepping out. "Thanks," Cooper muttered, unlocking the front. "You sick?" "No." "Then it's about the woman," she paused. "The one you rescued." He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Maya stepped closer, her tone softening. "Coop, what's going on?" He opened the envelope again and handed it to her. She read it, eyes narrowing slightly, then looked back up at him. "This is real?" "As real as the guy who handed it to me," he said. "Didn't leave a name. No way to reach her." Maya stared at the paper, then handed it back. "So what now?" Cooper looked out at the lot, where oil stains painted stories on cracked concrete. He'd lived most of his life in the same 10-mile radius, fixing engines and minding his own business. But now, someone from a world far outside his own had reached in, shaken it, and whispered, "Don't worry, this isn't over." And for the first time in years, he wasn't sure what to do next. But he knew one thing. He wasn't going back to pretending nothing had happened. The sound came first, a deep, rhythmic chopping that shook the windows. Cooper froze mid-step, a wrench in one hand, half-finished transmission. Rebuild sitting open on the lift. He looked toward the sky, then stepped outside just as the noise crescendoed into a full-body vibration. The clouds above the tree line began to split, and then it appeared. A helicopter, sleek, silver, silent in every way that mattered. It descended like something from a dream or a warning. Dust whipped through the lot, scattering leaves and loose receipts. Cooper stood there blinking, one hand raised instinctively to shield his eyes, heart pounding so loud he could barely hear the rotor blades. It landed with a low groan about 20 feet from the garage, its skids kissing the pavement like it had landed here before, like it knew exactly where to go. Cooper didn't move. He couldn't. Not until the side door cracked open and a man in a headset stepped down. "Mr. Maddox," the man shouted over the residual hum. Cooper nodded, throat too dry to speak. "I've been asked to escort you." "To where?" "She didn't say. Just asked me to come personally. Said you'd understand." The man held out a hand as if Cooper could simply step away from his entire life and climb aboard a machine like that, as if this was normal. Cooper glanced back at the garage, the lift, the tools, the open job ticket on the workbench, the half-finished cup of gas station coffee still steaming in the corner, and then back at the helicopter. He wasn't the kind of man who got swept up in someone else's life. He was rooted, practical. He solved problems with socket wrenches and timing belts. But now, something had shifted. Someone had shifted it. And the ground beneath him didn't feel quite so solid anymore. He stepped forward slowly, paused, then climbed in. The door shut behind him with a hiss. The world tilted. And as the helicopter rose, the town shrank below him. His garage, his quiet street, his old life. Whatever this was, it had just become real, and there was no turning back now. The flight was silent, except for the low thrum of the blades slicing through the air. Cooper sat rigid in the leather seat, hands gripping his knees, eyes flicking between the horizon and the polished cabin interior. He didn't belong here. Everything about the chopper, from the chrome hardware to the touchscreen dashboard, reeked of money, old money, quiet money, the kind that didn't shout but made things happen with a phone call and no explanation. He wasn't told where they were going, just strapped in, handed a headset, and given a bottle of water he didn't open. The pilot hadn't spoken since liftoff. There was no small talk, no itinerary, only altitude. Below, the landscape changed. Farm fields gave way to open hills, then long stretches of forest before the blue shimmer of water appeared on the horizon. The helicopter banked left, slow and smooth, revealing a private peninsula carved into the coast like a secret. On it sat a house, or rather a monument, floor-to-ceiling glass wrapped around a modern estate that seemed to float above the trees. A gravel driveway curved like a ribbon down to a slate platform designed for landings. Everything about it screamed intention. They touched down without a bump. Cooper didn't move at first. The pilot turned slightly, gesturing toward the door with a curt nod. So he stepped out. The wind died the moment the rotors slowed. The quiet was immediate and eerie. All Cooper could hear now was the crunch of his boots on stone as he approached the house. No one met him outside. No guards, no staff, just the door, already open. He hesitated at the threshold, one hand resting on the smooth frame, and then he saw her. She stood in the foyer, barefoot, hair down, wearing a simple white blouse and jeans that still probably cost more than his truck. Her face was calm, but her eyes told a different story. Soft, guarded, almost guilty. "You came," she said quietly, like it surprised her. "I didn't have much of a choice," he replied, voice rougher than he meant it to be. She smiled faintly. "I wanted to say thank you, but not in a letter." Cooper took one step inside. The door closed behind him. Everything had changed, again. She didn't offer a handshake. She didn't make some grand introduction. She just stood there, watching him like she wasn't sure if he was real, or maybe she wasn't sure if she wanted him to be. Cooper looked around the entryway. It wasn't cold the way he expected a place like this to be. It was sharp, modern, clean, sure, but not soulless. There were signs of life. A record player by the corner, books with worn spines stacked on a low table, a sweater carelessly draped over a chair. "I'm Celeste," she said finally, her voice softer than it had been in his memory. It didn't need to be louder. It settled in the room like it belonged there. He nodded slowly. "I figured that much." She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You probably have 1,000 questions." "Only one," Cooper replied. "Why me?" Celeste looked down for a beat, then back up. "Because you didn't hesitate. You didn't ask who I was, or what kind of car I drove, or whether I could afford to thank you later. You just got in the mud and pulled me out." "I didn't do it for credit." "I know that," she said, stepping forward. "That's why it mattered." They stood in silence, two people from entirely different worlds, tethered only by a moment neither of them had asked for. She gestured toward the hallway. "Would you sit with me? There's coffee, or something stronger, if you need it." He followed her down a corridor lit by tall windows and sun that spilled across hardwood floors. They ended up in a quiet room overlooking the sea. 2 chairs, a low fire, a tray with untouched coffee. Celeste poured for both of them, handed him a cup. Her fingers grazed his, not a touch with intention, just something human, something unplanned. "I've had a lot of people try to save me," she said, curling her legs beneath her, "but no one's ever actually done it." Cooper stared into the steam of his coffee, unsure what to say to that. Maybe he didn't need to say anything. Maybe being here was already saying enough. The coffee was bitter, probably some imported blend with a name he couldn't pronounce, but Cooper didn't complain. He didn't care about the taste, not when his thoughts were tangled in everything that didn't make sense. Celeste sat across from him, legs curled under her, staring out at the waves like she'd practiced looking calm. But it was a kind of calm that came with a price. He could see it in the way her jaw clenched when she wasn't speaking, the way her fingers tapped the porcelain cup in intervals like she was keeping time against something she couldn't control. "This place," Cooper said finally, glancing around the room, "doesn't exactly scream crash victim." She looked at him, amused but not offended. "I know." "You said people tried to save you." Celeste turned her gaze back to the window. "People try to own me," she corrected, "or fix me, or control me, but never save me. Not until you." He didn't know what to do with that. It didn't sound like a compliment. It sounded like a confession. "I didn't know who you were," he said. "Still don't, really. That's what made you different." He let that settle, let the silence stretch far enough to be honest. Finally, she set her cup down. "I was supposed to be in Manhattan that day. I had a meeting, press, everything. But I canceled. Drove north. No bodyguards, no staff, just me. First time in years." "And you crashed." "And I crashed," she repeated. "I'd barely made it 10 miles. There was something sad in the way she said it, like she wasn't talking about the wreck at all, like she was talking about her life. Cooper leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Why bring me here?" She didn't answer at first, just stood up and walked toward the wall of windows, her arms crossed tight over her chest. "Because I wanted to see if you were real," she whispered, "or if I made you up when I was bleeding out in a ditch." He stood slowly, not to move closer, just to remind her he was still there. "You didn't make me up," he said. Celeste turned toward him, her expression unreadable. And for the first time since that rainy highway, she looked at him like she believed it. She led him through the house without saying much. The place was bigger than it looked from the outside, quiet in that way only the wealthy could afford, with rooms that felt more like sanctuaries than places people actually lived in. The walls held art he didn't recognize, pieces that probably came with stories and price tags he'd never relate to. But nothing about it felt showy. It wasn't built to impress anyone. It was built to keep people out. Cooper noticed the details, the security system tucked into the corners of the ceiling, the subtle cameras, the fingerprint scanner by what looked like an office. There were layers here, walls behind walls. She might have invited him in, but the house still whispered about a life lived on guard. She brought him to a long hallway lined with glass that opened to a courtyard garden, one that had no business being this green after the kind of storm they'd just had. A path cut through the middle, flanked by hedges and white stones and a small iron bench at the center. "That was my mother's idea," Celeste said, noticing his glance. "She said you should always have something beautiful in the middle of your life, something untouched." Looks like it worked. Celeste offered the faintest smile. She died before it was finished. He didn't press. Some losses didn't want company. They just needed to be said out loud once to matter. They stopped in front of another room, this one different. Not open and glassy like the rest of the house, more private. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. "This is where I stay when I want to disappear," she said. Cooper stepped in behind her, taking in the space. No fancy art, no gold trim, just books. A fireplace, a worn armchair by the window. It was the first room in the house that felt lived in. "You disappear often?" he asked. Celeste stood with her back to him, fingers trailing along the edge of a bookshelf. "Often enough," she said. "But not like after the crash. That felt different. Like maybe I wasn't supposed to come back at all." He looked at her then, really looked. "You did come back." She turned to him. "I came back because of you." And for the first time, her voice broke just enough for him to hear the truth behind it. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the world still looked washed, muted, softer somehow, like it hadn't fully decided if it was done grieving. The same could have been said for her. Celeste sat cross-legged on the floor now, in that quiet room with the fireplace flickering low behind her, legs folded under a cashmere blanket, sleeves pushed to her elbows like formality had finally given up. Cooper leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching her thumb through a worn, leather-bound journal on her lap. She hadn't offered it to him. She didn't have to. He could see in her face that it wasn't meant for anyone but her. A world scribbled down in ink she'd never intended to share. "You always live like this?" he asked softly. "Alone in a house that looks like a magazine cover?" She looked up, not insulted, almost relieved by the question. "Not always," she said. "There were people here once, but when the spotlight turns on you long enough, you learn to shut the doors before someone decides to burn your house down." Cooper stepped in, slow, sat down across from her on the carpet, like they weren't separated by income or history or expectations too heavy to speak aloud, like they were just two people who'd survived something, different storms, same weight. "I didn't know who you were," he said. "Didn't matter then." "And now that you do?" she asked. He studied her for a moment, the way her fingers gripped the edge of the journal, the way her voice dropped just slightly when she asked. "I still don't think it matters," he said. "You bled the same. You shook the same. You looked at me like you were scared to die." Celeste blinked once. Hard, she closed the journal, laid it gently beside her like it was something fragile. "You're the only person in my life who's ever seen me like that and didn't try to use it," she said. Cooper leaned back on his hands, his voice steady. "I wasn't trying to see anything," he said. "I just didn't want you to die in a car alone." And for a moment, neither of them moved. Not because they didn't want to, but because they both knew the second they did, the moment would shift, and some part of them wasn't ready to let it go. Dinner wasn't planned. It just happened. A quiet transition from conversation to the sound of a wine bottle opening, from flickering firelight to the soft clinking of plates in a kitchen that looked like it had never been used. But Celeste moved through it like she'd done it 100 times, barefoot on tile, hair tucked behind her ear, humming something under her breath she didn't seem to know she was humming. Cooper sat at the island, elbows on the marble, watching her pull down 2 plates from a cabinet that probably cost more than his truck. The meal wasn't anything extravagant: grilled vegetables, a pan-seared steak, something that steamed with butter and rosemary. But the silence made it feel sacred, not awkward, not strained, just full of things neither of them were ready to say. When she finally sat across from him, tucking her legs under the chair, she exhaled like she'd been holding her breath since the crash. "I haven't done this in years," she said. "Cooked?" "No," she said, almost laughing. "Eaten dinner with someone who didn't want anything from me." Cooper looked at her, really looked. She didn't say it like a complaint, more like an observation, something accepted, normalized. He took a bite, nodded slowly. "You cook like someone who should do it more often." She smiled into her glass. "You eat like someone who doesn't compliment lightly." Guilty. They ate in slow silence, interrupted only by the occasional scrape of a fork or the wind brushing past the windows. It should have felt surreal, this woman, this house, this impossible moment, but somehow it didn't. It felt like they were 2 people stripped of everything unnecessary, just skin and breath, and something barely formed, but deeply felt. After they cleared the dishes, Celeste leaned back against the counter, arms folded. Her expression softened. "I didn't bring you here just to thank you." Cooper waited. She stepped closer, her voice dropping. "I brought you here because ever since that day, I haven't been able to stop thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't stopped, if you hadn't pulled over." He didn't say anything, didn't need to, because he hadn't been able to stop thinking about it either. The evening air was colder now. A hush had fallen over the house, the kind that only happens when words run out but something heavier still lingers in the room. Celeste stood at the window with her arms wrapped around herself, staring out at the black expanse of ocean. The reflection of the fire flickered on the glass like ghosts behind her. Cooper stayed near the doorway, one hand braced against the frame, like moving too quickly might break whatever was happening between them. "I don't usually let people see this," she said without turning around. "This version of me." He didn't respond right away. There were 100 things he could have said, but none of them seemed to fit. So he waited. "My name isn't usually just Celeste," she added. "It's Celeste Alden, and most people don't say it without checking their tone first." "I didn't know," Cooper said. "I know, that's why I called you." She finally turned around, and something in her face shifted. Not a performance, not a mask, just a woman with too much history behind her eyes, trying to figure out if it was safe to be seen. He stepped into the room, slow, deliberate. "I'm not afraid of your name." She tilted her head slightly. "You should be. It comes with things, expectations, attention, baggage." "I carry engines for a living," he said. "I can handle baggage." That made her smile, even if only for a second. She sat down in the chair by the fire, and he took the one across from her. The heat between them wasn't from the flames. It was from the fact that they were saying everything they didn't have the courage to spell out. "Do you know what it's like to be surrounded by people but still feel like you're drowning?" she asked. Cooper nodded slowly. "Yeah, except I'm usually holding the wrench while I do it." Celeste looked at him like she didn't want to blink. "I'm tired of drowning," she whispered. And even though he didn't touch her, even though he didn't reach out or move closer, Cooper's voice landed like an anchor. "Then maybe it's time you stopped swimming alone." The storm inside her broke sometime after midnight. Not with tears or raised voices, not with any dramatic collapse. It broke in silence, in the way her shoulders dropped as she walked him to the guest room down the hall, in the way she lingered at the doorway like she was weighing something she couldn't name. Cooper stood there, not pushing, Not pulling, just waiting. He could see it, something cracking in her, something delicate that had been braced for years but was finally giving way. "You know this isn't normal, right?" she said quietly. He gave a small nod. "No part of this has been." Celeste looked down at her hands, fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. "I've had people come to this house before, for business, for status, for access. You're the first person who's ever come here because I asked just to talk. Then I guess we both walked into something new." She leaned against the frame, eyes tired but honest. "I'm not used to people who don't need something from me." Cooper held her gaze. "Maybe that's the problem. Everyone wants something from you, but no one sees you." She blinked once, her breath caught, just for a second, and then she stepped back. "Good night, Cooper." "Good night, Celeste." The door clicked shut, but neither of them slept. He lay on top of the covers in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, like it might answer all the questions spinning in his head. He didn't know what this was between them, some collision of trauma and timing, or the start of something real, but it was growing roots fast, and he wasn't sure if he should water it or run. In the next room she was still awake too. He could hear the soft creak of floorboards, the faint shuffle of her pacing, like her mind was as restless as his, and when the house finally fell quiet, it wasn't because anything had ended, it was because they were both holding their breath, waiting to see what the morning would bring when everything they'd tried to keep buried had finally surfaced. The morning arrived slow and golden, like it didn't want to interrupt. Sunlight filtered through the massive windows of the house, throwing long streaks across polished floors. Cooper was already awake when the first ray touched the edge of the guest bed. He hadn't slept much, restless dreams filled with the sound of her voice, the weight of that night, the tension that still hadn't broken. He found her in the kitchen, barefoot again, hair messy from sleep, cradling a mug between both hands like it was the only thing grounding her. She didn't speak when he walked in, just handed him a second cup like they'd been doing this for years. Like the silence between them was understood, not avoided. Cooper took a sip, let the heat fill the space between his chest and throat. "You always look this peaceful in the morning?" he asked, voice low. Celeste glanced at him sideways, one eyebrow raised. "You didn't see me 10 minutes ago." He smiled, leaning back against the counter. There was something unspoken in the air, something new, the kind of quiet you get when two people finally admit to themselves that they're standing in the middle of something fragile but undeniable. "I've got questions," he said after a minute. Celeste nodded, sipping her coffee. "I figured you would. That guy who brought the letter, the helicopter, that's not just thanks for pulling me out of a wreck energy, that's something else." She didn't flinch. "I wanted to see if you'd come." "Why?" "Because the crash didn't scare me as much as what came after, the silence. The fact that I wanted to see you again, more than I wanted to go back to everything I was doing before." He looked at her, really looked. "That sounds like a pretty dangerous realization," he said. "It was," she said. "Still is." Cooper set his mug down. "And what do you want now?" Celeste hesitated, then stepped closer, just close enough that he could feel her heat, her breath, the tremble she tried to hide. "I want to stop pretending I don't remember what it felt like to be in your arms when I thought I was dying," she said. And just like that, the space between them stopped being safe. It started becoming honest. He didn't touch her, not yet. But the way she stood there, barefoot on marble, eyes wide and uncertain, it felt like the entire world had narrowed to that one moment. Cooper had never been good with feelings, not the big ones, the ones that caught in your throat and asked for more than you were ready to give. But right now, silence felt like cowardice. And she deserved more than that. "You were scared," he said, voice quiet, rough around the edges. "That day. I saw it in your face." "I was," she admitted, "but not just of dying." He tilted his head, searching her expression. "Then what? Of being alone when it happened, of disappearing without anyone really knowing who I was." or worse, of realizing no one ever really had. That hit deeper than she probably meant it to, because Cooper understood what it meant to feel invisible in plain sight, to walk into rooms and never quite fit, to be useful but not known. He carried that feeling every day inside his shop. People trusted him with their engines, their timing belts, their breakdowns, but never their lives. "You weren't alone," he said. "Not then." She stepped closer. "I know. That's what kept me awake after the hospital. Not the pain, not the press, not the headlines, just the memory of how it felt when you held me, like I mattered." "You did." Her breath caught, and in that silence, something between them cracked open. The air shifted. She reached out, tentative, fingers brushing the side of his hand. It wasn't a kiss. It wasn't even a promise. It was something smaller, but heavier. A contact layered in gratitude and need, and a fear that maybe, if she asked for too much, it would all disappear. "I don't do this," she whispered. "Not with people. Not like this." Cooper laced his fingers through hers slowly, deliberately. "Then let's not call it anything," he said. "Let's just feel it for what it is." And in that moment, standing barefoot in her kitchen with the past behind them and something unnamed between them, she nodded like that was enough. Because for now it was. They spent the rest of the morning in a kind of suspended reality, moving through the house like people who'd forgotten what came before and hadn't yet decided what came next. The world outside still existed, calls unanswered, meetings missed, obligations ticking like a distant clock. But in here, everything slowed. Time became something fluid, measured not in hours, but in glances, in silences, in breaths that almost became words. Cooper wandered the property with her. The garden path was still wet from the storm, gravel crunching softly beneath their feet. She told him little things about the trees she'd planted, the rooms she never entered, the books she reread when the weight of everything became too much. It wasn't small talk, it was survival talk, the kind you shared only when you'd been cracked open and didn't care who saw inside. But even in the quiet, something kept tugging at him, a question he hadn't asked yet, one that lingered just under his skin. They sat on the bench at the edge of the garden, ocean stretching in the distance like a secret. Celeste tucked her knees to her chest, fingers threading through the sleeves of her sweater. "There's something I've been meaning to ask," Cooper said finally. She glanced at him. "I figured. That day, the crash, were you running from something?" She didn't answer right away, just stared out at the water like it might carry her truth if she held her breath long enough. "I was supposed to be in the city," she said. "2 interviews, 1 board meeting, dinner with a man I didn't love, pretending we were something we weren't for the sake of optics." He watched her carefully, not interrupting. "I took the car and drove north. No security, no staff. I didn't tell anyone. I just left." "Why?" Celeste turned toward him. Her eyes were calm, but the storm was still there, just deeper now. "Because I needed to feel like I still belonged to myself, even if just for a few hours." "And did you?" She smiled sadly. "Not until you pulled me out of that wreck." And just like that, the air between them wasn't just charged. It was sacred. Because now, they both knew the truth. She hadn't been trying to disappear, she'd been trying to be found. Later that afternoon, the illusion of stillness broke. It started with a single vibration, Celeste's phone, buzzing on the kitchen counter, forgotten beneath a linen napkin. She didn't move at first, just stared at it as it pulsed again, then again, like a heartbeat trying to remind her of everything she'd tried to outrun. Cooper stood near the sink, drying his hands, watching her face shift from calm to something unreadable. She finally picked it up. Read the screen. The light in her eyes dimmed. "What is it?" Cooper asked. "Press," she murmured. "They found out where I've been." He took a step closer. "You said you didn't tell anyone." "I didn't," she said, voice sharper now, more guarded. "But they track everything. Flight logs, movement patterns, phone activity. I should have known they'd find me eventually. The name Alden wasn't just a name, it was a signal flare, the kind that drew attention even when she whispered. And now the world she'd closed the door on was already prying it open. Cooper could feel her armor coming back piece by piece, shoulders straightening and eyes narrowing, voice cooling. The woman who had sat barefoot by the fire last night was already slipping behind something reinforced. "You want me to leave," he said. Not a question, just a quiet observation. Celeste looked up sharply. "No, I don't want you in the middle of this." "I already am. That's what I'm afraid of." The air between them thickened, filled with words neither of them wanted to say. He stepped closer anyway. "I didn't pull you out of that car so you could run back into a different kind of wreck." Her jaw clenched. "You think I don't know that? I think you've been surviving so long you forgot what it means to let someone stand beside you." She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. The phone buzzed again in her hand. This time she silenced it, and for just a second her fingers trembled. She didn't ask him to stay, but she didn't ask him to go either, which, coming from her, said more than words ever could. The next morning, Cooper woke up to the sound of raised voices echoing down the hallway. He didn't move at first, just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening. The voices were muffled, one sharp male, calculated, the other hers. Controlled but laced with a tone he hadn't heard before. Not fear, not anger, something quieter. Something like resignation. He got dressed without thinking. Shirt, jeans, boots. The moment he stepped into the hallway, the voices stopped. A door shut. Footsteps faded down the hall. He found her in the kitchen, same white sweater as the night before, hair pulled back, eyes distant. "Someone here?" he asked. She nodded once, pouring coffee with a hand too steady to be natural. "My head of PR. He flew in this morning." "Let me guess, he's not thrilled about me being here." Celeste let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. He said having an unknown variable in the house right now could complicate perception. Cooper leaned against the counter, arms folded. "And what do you say?" "I say perception can go to hell." She set the coffee down and looked at him then, really looked. "But it doesn't change the fact that this world I've built, it's full of people who measure worth in headlines, who think vulnerability is a liability." "And you let them?" "I have to." "No," he said. "You don't. You choose to." She didn't argue. She just looked away, jaw tight. There was a silence between them that wasn't cold, but it wasn't warm either. It was the space between choices, between the life she'd spent building and the one she was just beginning to imagine. "Are you afraid of what they'll think?" Cooper asked. "I'm afraid of what they'll do," she said. "To you, to me, to this." He nodded slowly. "Then maybe the real question is, are you willing to lose what we've started to keep the version of your life they think you should have?" Celeste didn't answer, because the answer wasn't simple, and maybe, deep down, she already knew. The cost of living behind glass was never feeling the sun on your skin, and he was the first real thing she'd felt in a very long time. They didn't speak much after that, not because there was nothing to say, but because too much had already been said. And not all of it had landed the way it was meant to. The air in the house had changed. It was tighter now, like it was bracing for something neither of them wanted to name. Cooper sat in the garden for most of the afternoon, hands stained from tightening a loose hinge on one of the wrought iron gates, trying to fix something, anything, because fixing things was the only way he knew how to think. He saw the cars before he heard them. 3 black SUVs pulled through the front gates like they owned the road, tires crunching over gravel with synchronized confidence. Men in tailored suits stepped out, one holding a briefcase, another already typing into a phone, and a third glancing around like he was casing the place. Corporate, polished, and unmistakably part of her world. Cooper didn't move. The front door opened, and Celeste stepped outside. Her face was calm, unreadable. The fire from yesterday was gone. In its place was a mask he hadn't seen before, precise, polite, calculated. She met the men halfway down the steps and exchanged a few words too low to hear. One of them glanced toward Cooper in the garden. Their eyes met for half a second. Cooper didn't look away. The moment passed. Celeste led them inside, and the door closed behind her. The house swallowed her whole. He stayed in the garden, but everything inside him burned, not with jealousy, not even with anger, just with the cold, creeping feeling of reality crawling back in through the cracks. This was the part he hadn't been invited into. The meetings behind the meetings, the rooms with no windows. He thought about the note she had sent him. "You saved my life. I don't know how to thank you." And now, watching those men step into her world like they belonged there, he couldn't help but wonder if that thank you had already reached its limit. Because maybe it wasn't the car crash that was the wreck. Maybe it was everything that came after. And maybe he was standing in the middle of it, hoping it wouldn't be the last time she looked at him like he was more than a complication. By the time the sun started bleeding into the sea, the black cars were gone. Cooper watched them disappear down the winding drive without moving from the bench. He'd sat there for hours, unmoved, eyes fixed on the front of the house like it might answer the question Celeste hadn't. A part of him had expected her to come outside once they left, maybe walk down that stone path barefoot again, maybe sit beside him like nothing had shifted. But the door stayed closed. The house stayed silent. He stood eventually, legs stiff, hands in his pockets, and made his way inside. She was in the study, lights dimmed, a drink in her hand she hadn't touched. Her posture was perfect, too perfect, like she was holding herself together through muscle memory alone. He leaned against the frame of the doorway. She didn't look up. "They said I need to issue a statement," she said, "that there's a rumor I'm involved with someone, that I've been hiding out here instead of attending key investor meetings." "You have been," he said. She nodded once, eyes on the fire, expression unreadable. They wanted names, background checks, a narrative they can control. "And did you give them one?" She finally looked at him. Her eyes didn't soften. If anything, they looked like glass, clear, beautiful, and cold from the inside out. "I told them there's nothing to explain." His jaw tightened. "That right?" "It's easier that way," she said. "Cleaner." He took a slow breath. "For who?" "Everyone." "No," Cooper said, stepping into the room. "Not for me." Something flickered in her eyes, something that looked dangerously close to guilt. "Coop, you brought me into this," he said, voice low. "You asked me to come here. You told me I was the only one who didn't want anything from you, and now you're acting like I was a mistake that needs to be rewritten." She looked down, then away, like the weight of it finally landed. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she whispered. He nodded. "Yeah, but you let it." And then he turned and walked out, quietly, without slamming doors or shouting words he couldn't take back. Because some things didn't need noise to be broken. Some things just needed silence to show how far they'd already fallen. He didn't sleep that night. The guest bed felt foreign now, like it had betrayed him. The same walls that once held warmth now echoed with everything left unsaid. Cooper lay staring at the ceiling, fully dressed, arms behind his head, jaw tight with a kind of tension that couldn't be walked off or wrenched loose. He'd spent his life solving problems with his hands, nuts, bolts, broken parts, bad timing. But this wasn't something he could fix, not when the person breaking it was her. Just before dawn he packed, not much, a few clothes, his wallet, the envelope she'd sent him, folded once, still smelling faintly of whatever perfume clung to her handwriting. He left it on the nightstand, no note, no explanation. He figured she'd understand. The hallway was quiet as he walked through it, the house dark but not asleep. He wondered if she'd hear the door, if she was listening from behind one of those doors, holding her breath, waiting for the sound of him leaving so she wouldn't have to be the one to ask him to. When he stepped outside, the air was heavy. Mist hung low over the garden. The gravel crunched beneath his boots like it was saying goodbye. He had made it halfway down the drive when he heard it. "Cooper!" Her voice, sharp and cracked, and too late, echoed through the morning silence. He stopped, but didn't turn. "I didn't want it to end like this," she said, barefoot on the steps, her arms wrapped around herself, like she was trying to hold in something breaking. He stood there a moment, then looked back at her. "I know," he said, "but you didn't want it to start either." She stepped forward, one hand reaching out like that alone could stop him. "You don't understand." "I do," he said. "That's the problem." She opened her mouth, then closed it again. No press speech, no polished damage control, just a woman on a porch watching something real walk away because she didn't know how to hold it without apologizing for it. He turned and kept walking, and the hardest part was, she didn't stop him. The shop was quiet when he got back. Still smelled like oil and metal, like nothing had changed, but everything had. Cooper parked his truck out front, stepped inside, and let the door swing shut behind him. The silence swallowed him like a familiar ache. He walked past the lifted chassis he'd left half-finished days ago, past the stack of invoices, past the ghost of who he'd been before she pulled him into her world, and then pushed him back out of it. He didn't turn on the lights, just stood in the middle of the garage, letting the weight settle. Maya showed up around noon. She didn't call. She never did when something was wrong. She found him in the back room, hands deep in an old carburetor, grease up to his wrists like he was trying to scrub her memory out with every turn of the wrench. "You're back early," she said gently, leaning against the doorway. Cooper didn't look up. "Change of plans." "You okay?" He paused for half a breath. "No." She stepped closer, crossed her arms, and waited. Not to fix him, just to be there. That was her way. "She asked me into her life," he said after a minute, then closed the door when people started looking through the windows. Maya sighed. "Sounds like someone who's used to locking doors before she gets hurt. I wasn't going to hurt her." "I know." "But she didn't." That part he couldn't say out loud, the part where he'd felt something real in a place full of masks, the part where her silence had cut deeper than anything she could have said, the part where he'd stood in front of her, willing to fight, and she'd flinched like love was a liability. Maya sat on the stool across from him. "You loved her." Cooper didn't deny it. "Then what are you going to do?" He tightened the bolt slowly, the sound sharp and deliberate. "I'm going to fix what I can," he said, "and try to forget what I can't." But even as he said it, he knew forgetting her wasn't something he'd be able to do with his hands. This time the damage was internal, and some things don't come with replacement parts. 3 days passed, long, quiet, unremarkable days filled with engine noise and silence that felt louder than any wrench drop or misfire. Cooper didn't talk about her, didn't mention the note she wrote, or the way she'd stood on that porch like she wanted to scream but couldn't even speak. He just worked. Car after car, job after job. Like if he could just stay busy enough, he'd forget what it felt like when she looked at him like he mattered, then acted like he didn't. But grief doesn't work like that. Not the kind you earn, not the kind that comes from hope. She didn't call, didn't send another letter, no helicopter, no suited messengers with cryptic notes or midnight apologies. And maybe that was the worst part, how quiet it all ended, not with a fight, just with the sound of footsteps walking away. On the 4th night it rained again, the same kind of storm as before, low, heavy, thunder tucked behind the clouds like a warning. He stood by the shop window, watching the street lights blur, arms crossed over his chest, jaw locked. It had started with rain. It should have ended differently. He grabbed his keys. The drive was muscle memory. County Road 9 hadn't changed. Same curve, same ditch, same patch of scorched earth where the grass never quite grew back. He pulled over, stepped out into the storm, and just stood there in the dark, the rain soaking through his shirt like penance. His boots sank slightly into the mud, the same way they had that day when he dragged her from the wreck and didn't care who she was. He crouched down, ran his fingers through the dirt. the crushed gravel, the broken place where something had started and where now something felt officially gone. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just stood there, water dripping from his fingertips, knowing this was the last place they'd ever been equals. Just two people, no headlines, no expectations. Back when saving her hadn't meant losing himself. And when he got back in the truck, it felt a little emptier than before, like he wasn't just driving away from a memory, but from a version of himself he couldn't quite get back to. The shop was closed early the next evening, not for any reason he could name, not because of an emergency or a holiday, just because Cooper couldn't pretend anymore. The ache hadn't dulled. It had shifted, sure, buried itself beneath routine and exhaust fumes, and the half-hearted smiles he gave to customers who didn't notice the difference. But it was still there, that quiet ache of something unfinished. He was locking up when he heard it, a low hum, distant but growing, vibrating in his chest before it ever touched his ears. He knew the sound now, intimately. It didn't belong in this town, not on this street, not behind his garage. The sky above was bruised purple with sunset, and there it was, slicing through it like a ghost from a life he thought he'd left behind. The helicopter, same silver body, same steady descent, same impossible disruption to the world he'd tried to go back to. Cooper stood still as it landed behind the shop, dust kicking up into the air, tools vibrating on the wall, heart pounding like it was trying to climb out of his chest. He should have turned and walked inside, should have ignored it, should have let it land and lift off again without ever looking back. But he didn't, because some part of him had been waiting. The door opened. This time, no messenger stepped out, no assistant, no guard, just her, Celeste. No heels, no armor, no polished corporate calm, just jeans, a raincoat, and eyes that held something fragile, something she'd been holding too long. He didn't speak, neither did she. She walked across the lot like the weight of her name wasn't dragging behind her for once. Like maybe, just maybe, this time she wasn't here to control the story. She stopped in front of him, rain clinging to the ends of her hair. "I didn't come to fix anything," she said quietly. "I came because I realized I left something in that ditch too, and it wasn't just fear." He swallowed hard, hands at his sides, every part of him still. What was it? Celeste looked at him like it hurt, like the answer had been clawing at her since the day she let him walk. "You." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The air was thick with everything they'd left unsaid, with the weight of her silence, with the sound of rain tapping against the concrete like a slow drum roll waiting for the truth to finally speak. Cooper stood there like the ground beneath him might shift at any second, not from fear, but from hope. And hope, when you've already let something go, is a dangerous thing to feel again. "You walked away," he said, not as an accusation, but as a truth he hadn't spoken out loud until now. "I know," Celeste whispered. Her voice was tight, frayed at the edges. "Because I thought I had to. Because I've spent so long living in a world where being seen meant being used. And you were the first thing that didn't ask me for anything." "I didn't need anything," he said, "but I wanted something, and you knew that." She nodded slowly, eyes locked on his. "I wanted it too." "Then why bury it?" "Because wanting something doesn't mean knowing how to keep it. And I didn't know how to keep you without breaking you, without pulling you into my chaos and watching you disappear under it." He stepped forward just once, rain dripping from his shoulders, hands clenched like he wasn't sure if he was angry or heartbroken or something heavier than both. "I didn't need your world, Celeste. I didn't need the headlines or the cars or the damn chopper. I just needed you to choose me when it mattered. I'm choosing you now." The words landed softly, but they hit hard. She stepped closer, close enough for him to see the regret written all over her face. Not performative, not rehearsed, just raw. "I'm not asking you to forget what I did," she said, "but I'm asking if you still believe that moment in the rain meant something." He stared at her for a long time. It meant everything, he said. And then she reached for his hand, not to pull him, not to lead, but just to feel if he was still real, still hers. And this time, he didn't let go. The garage smelled like it always did, oil, metal, a hint of old coffee in the corner, but tonight it felt different, warmer, lived in, like the quiet had softened into something more forgiving. The rain still tapped on the roof, steady and low, but now it wasn't lonely, it was background music. Celeste stood near the tool bench, fingers brushing over the edge like she was memorizing it, like she needed to ground herself in something real. Her raincoat was draped over a stool, her hair damp and curling slightly at the edges. No press, no assistants, no staged lighting or talking points, just her. And him. Cooper moved through the shop without saying much, wiping grease from his hands, setting down a wrench he hadn't realized he was still holding. He looked at her like he was trying to believe this wasn't just a temporary return, like any second she might disappear again, swallowed back into a world that only knew how to take. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "I'm not here because I owe you," she replied. "I'm here because I never stopped feeling like something unfinished lived in this place." He walked over, close enough to see the sincerity in her eyes. "This isn't your world," he said quietly. She shook her head. "No, but it's the only place I've ever felt like I didn't have to hide." Cooper reached up, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, fingers lingering there for a second longer than they needed to. "You scared the hell out of me," he said. She smiled softly. "You pulled me out of a wreck before you even knew my name, and I'd do it again." "I know." The silence that followed didn't feel like a pause. It felt like peace. And when she leaned into him, when he wrapped his arms around her like he'd been waiting every minute since she left to do it again, it didn't feel like a reunion. It felt like a beginning. Outside, the helicopter waited, silent, ready to take her wherever she wanted. But tonight, for the first time, she didn't want to leave, because she had already landed, right here with him.